There was once a version of you that existed before the world taught you to doubt yourself, before you began measuring your worth through people's reactions, before rejection made you afraid of being fully seen, before you learned how to smile while hiding what was really happening inside you. As a child, your existence was natural. You did not wake up wondering if you were enough. You did not constantly compare yourself to strangers. You did not need the world's approval just to feel valuable. But slowly, without even noticing it, you began borrowing your identity from other people's minds. You started seeing yourself through their opinions, through their praise, through their silence, through their rejection, through the way they looked at you. And from that moment on, you stopped asking, "Who am I?" and began asking, "How am I being seen?" The Vedas warned humanity about this thousands of years ago. They said the moment a human being becomes dependent on outside reflection, they slowly lose connection with their true nature. And that is why so many people feel exhausted today, because they are no longer living freely. They are performing strength while secretly hurting, performing happiness while feeling empty, performing versions of themselves just to remain accepted. And after years of doing this, most people no longer recognize their own soul. But tonight, this is not another message telling you to become someone new. This is a message about remembering the self you lost while trying to survive the world. The self beneath the masks, the self beneath the fear, the self beneath the endless need to be loved, validated, and understood. And if you listen carefully tonight, you may finally hear the voice of that forgotten self again. The world taught you to see yourself through broken mirrors. From the very beginning of your life, the world quietly trained you to search for yourself in other people's eyes instead of discovering yourself within. Before you were even old enough to understand your own existence, people had already begun shaping the image you would one day call me. Family members, teachers, friends, society, and even strangers slowly influenced the way you looked at yourself. They praised certain parts of you while ignoring other parts completely. They rewarded the behaviors that made them comfortable and discouraged the parts of you that felt too emotional, too sensitive, too quiet, too honest, too different, or too real. Without realizing it, you slowly learned a dangerous lesson. You learned that being accepted mattered more than being authentic. You learned that approval brings safety, while rejection creates pain. So naturally, like most human beings, you adapted yourself to survive emotionally. The Vedas understood this tragedy thousands of years ago. They taught that the human mind becomes trapped the moment it begins depending on outside reflection to understand its own value. A mirror can only show the surface of a person, yet most people spend their entire lives trying to discover their identity through the opinions, reactions, and judgments of others. That is why so many people today feel emotionally tired even when their life looks normal from the outside. Their attention is constantly focused outward. They are always thinking about how they appear instead of feeling who they truly are. Slowly, you began measuring your worth through reactions. A compliment could make you feel valuable for an entire day, while a single criticism could quietly destroy your peace for weeks. One person's approval could lift your confidence, while one moment of rejection could make you question your entire identity. This is how dependence on external reflection begins. The emotional state becomes controlled by the outside world. You started adjusting yourself depending on who you were around. In one room, you became quieter because you feared judgment. In another room, you became more entertaining because you wanted attention. Around certain people, you hid your emotions because you feared appearing weak. Around others, you exaggerated parts of your personality just to feel noticed. Little by little, your natural self became divided into different performances created for acceptance and survival. And the frightening part is that this happens so slowly, most people never notice it. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to abandon themselves completely. It happens through small emotional compromises repeated over many years. A little silence to avoid conflict, a little pretending to fit in, a little self-betrayal to avoid loneliness, a little hiding to avoid rejection. But eventually, these small compromises become patterns, and those patterns slowly become identity. The painful truth is that many people never truly meet themselves. They only meet the version shaped by society's expectations. They know the personality built from fear, validation, comparison, pressure, and emotional conditioning, but they do not know the silent awareness underneath all of it. They know the mask better than the soul wearing it. The world handed you broken mirrors and then convinced you those reflections were your true face. But broken mirrors cannot show truth clearly. They only show distorted images shaped by other people's fears, insecurities, desires, and opinions. When someone rejects you, it often reflects their own limitations, not your worth. When someone praises you, it may only reflect the role they want you to play in their life. Yet most people absorb every reaction deeply and use it to define themselves. This is why inner peace feels so far away for many souls. Their sense of self changes depending on who is looking at them. One moment they feel important, the next moment they feel invisible. One moment they feel beautiful, the next moment they feel unworthy. One moment they feel confident, the next moment they feel ashamed. Their identity constantly moves because it was never rooted in something stable. It was built on approval, and approval changes constantly. The Vedas teach that suffering begins the moment a person forgets their original nature and becomes hypnotized by appearances. And this forgetting does not happen loudly. Life does not warn you when it starts happening. It happens quietly through years of comparison, rejection, praise, fear, social pressure, heartbreak, emotional adaptation, and the endless need to feel accepted, until one day you suddenly realize you have spent most of your life trying to become acceptable instead of becoming true. And perhaps the deepest sadness is this: the world never demanded your complete disappearance all at once. It only asked for small pieces of you in the beginning, just enough to make you easier to control, easier to understand, easier to fit inside expectations. But over time, those small sacrifices became so normal that you forgot what your untouched self even felt like. You stopped speaking certain truths because you feared being misunderstood. You stopped expressing certain emotions because you feared appearing weak. You stopped following certain instincts because you feared disappointing others. Gradually, the performance became stronger than the person underneath it. Many people spend their entire lives protecting an image, while their real self quietly waits beneath the surface. They become experts at appearing okay while feeling disconnected inside. They become skilled at gaining attention while secretly feeling unseen. They become successful at pleasing others while slowly losing connection with their own soul. But the Vedas remind us of something deeply important. Beneath every mask, every role, every fear, every personality, and every performance, there is still something untouched within you, something ancient, something silent, something peaceful, something that existed long before the world taught you to doubt yourself. That presence does not need validation to exist. It does not become more valuable through praise or less valuable through rejection. It remains whole beneath every emotional storm, quietly watching every version of you come and go. And maybe that is why so many people feel an unexplained emptiness deep inside, because no amount of approval can satisfy a soul that has become disconnected from itself. External validation can comfort the ego temporarily, but it cannot replace inner truth. The soul does not want endless performance. It wants remembrance. It wants you to stop searching for yourself in broken mirrors. It wants you to remember the self that existed before fear shaped your personality. The self that existed before comparison poisoned your peace. The self that existed before the world convinced you that you were only worthy when accepted. And even now, after everything you have been through, that forgotten self is still waiting for you in silence, hoping one day you will stop looking outside long enough to finally see what was always within you. You slowly abandoned your soul just to feel accepted. One of the deepest fears hidden inside the human heart is the fear of rejection. Most people do not even realize how much of their life is secretly controlled by this fear. The fear of being disliked, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of being left behind, the fear of not being enough for others to stay. Because of this fear, people slowly begin changing themselves in ways they barely notice. Not because they are fake people, but because they are emotionally trying to survive. The Vedas understood this long ago. They taught that when awareness is lost, the human mind becomes desperate for acceptance. And once acceptance becomes more important than truth, the soul slowly begins disappearing beneath performance. A person starts shaping their entire identity around what feels emotionally safe, instead of what feels deeply real. At first, the changes are very small and almost invisible. You stop saying certain things because you do not want conflict. You become quieter around people who make you feel judged. You hide your sadness because you do not want to appear weak. You laugh at things that do not truly feel funny just to avoid feeling disconnected from others. You agree with opinions you do not fully believe because standing alone feels uncomfortable. Little by little, you begin editing yourself for acceptance. And over time, these small emotional adjustments slowly become your personality. You stop asking yourself, what feels true? You start asking what will keep people comfortable. That is the moment self-abandonment quietly begins. The painful part is that most people do not notice this happening because society rewards it. People praise you when you become easier to control, easier to understand, easier to fit inside expectations. They call it maturity. They call it being likable. They call it fitting in. But deep inside, something within you begins feeling exhausted because the soul was never designed to live as a performance. The Vedas describe this as a form of spiritual disconnection. The real self becomes buried beneath layers of emotional conditioning until a person no longer remembers what their untouched nature even feels like. They become so focused on maintaining acceptance that they lose connection with their own instincts, emotions, and truth. This is why so many people feel emotionally drained without understanding why. Pretending consumes enormous inner energy. Constantly monitoring yourself, adjusting your behavior, filtering your words, suppressing emotions, and shaping your personality for different people slowly becomes exhausting. Even when you are smiling externally, internally you feel disconnected because you are carrying versions of yourself that were created for survival, not authenticity. Many people spend years becoming the version others wanted while secretly feeling empty inside. They become the strong one because vulnerability was rejected. They become the funny one because sadness made others uncomfortable. They become the quiet one because speaking honestly created conflict. They become the people pleaser because abandonment terrified them. And eventually they become so attached to these roles that they no longer know who they are without them. This is why loneliness can still exist even when you are surrounded by people. Because the deepest loneliness is not the absence of company, it is the absence of your real self. It is the pain of feeling unseen because nobody is truly meeting the person behind the mask. The tragedy is that many people spend their entire lives trying to become lovable while abandoning the very parts of themselves that needed love the most. They reject their own emotions before others can reject them. They silence their truth before others can criticize it. They hide their natural personality before others can misunderstand it. Slowly, they become emotionally disconnected from themselves. And the more disconnected a person becomes from their true nature, the more dependent they become on validation. Because once you lose connection with your own inner worth, you begin depending on outside approval to feel valuable. Compliments become emotional survival. Attention becomes emotional comfort. Acceptance becomes emotional security. Rejection begins feeling unbearable because your identity now depends on being wanted by others. But the Vedas repeatedly remind us of something powerful. No amount of external acceptance can heal the pain created by self-abandonment. You can be admired by thousands of people and still feel empty inside because the soul does not crave popularity. It craves alignment. It craves honesty. It craves the freedom to exist without constantly performing for approval. This is why some people suddenly reach a point where they feel deeply exhausted with everything. They become tired of pretending, tired of shrinking themselves, tired of constantly adapting to keep relationships alive, tired of carrying emotional masks that no longer feel natural. The soul begins resisting the performance because truth can only remain buried for so long before it starts calling you back to yourself. And often, this awakening begins through pain. Sometimes heartbreak forces you to notice how much of yourself you abandoned to keep someone close. Sometimes loneliness forces you to realize you were surrounded by people who only loved the version of you that made them comfortable. Sometimes emotional exhaustion finally reveals how much energy you have spent trying to be accepted. The Vedas teach that suffering often becomes the doorway back to awareness because pain exposes illusion. It reveals the places where you betrayed yourself. It reveals the relationships where you abandoned your truth. It reveals the identities built entirely around fear of rejection. And although this realization can feel painful, it is also sacred. Because the moment you become aware of your self-abandonment is the moment healing can finally begin. Real peace does not come from becoming perfect for others. Real peace comes from returning to yourself. It comes from speaking honestly without constantly fearing rejection. It comes from feeling emotions without shame. It comes from trusting your inner truth even when others do not fully understand it. It comes from realizing that your worth was never supposed to depend on how many people approved of you. The soul does not become free when everyone accepts you. The soul becomes free when you stop abandoning yourself just to be accepted. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson hidden inside all human suffering. The world taught you to chase love by becoming someone else. But the Vedas quietly whisper a different truth. The moment you stop betraying your own soul for acceptance is the moment your real healing finally begins. Your identity was built from other people's reactions. Most people believe their identity was created naturally. They believe the person they have become is completely their own. But the Vedas reveal something far deeper and far more unsettling. Much of what you call yourself was slowly built through reactions from other people. Your personality, your fears, your confidence, your insecurities, and even the way you see your own value were shaped through years of emotional conditioning. From childhood, you were constantly being taught who you should become. Every reaction around you silently influenced your identity. When people praised certain behaviors, your mind learned to repeat them. When people rejected certain emotions, your mind learned to hide them. When love, attention, or approval were given conditionally, your personality slowly adapted in order to keep receiving acceptance. This conditioning became so normal that you stopped noticing it. If people praised your intelligence, you became attached to being smart. You feared failure because failure threatened the identity you built around achievement. If people admired your appearance, you became emotionally attached to beauty and external validation. If people appreciated your obedience, you learned to suppress disagreement and became afraid of disappointing others. If expressing emotion caused rejection, you trained yourself to appear emotionally controlled even when your heart was hurting deeply. Slowly, your identity became a survival strategy. The Vedas teach that the false self is not created in one moment. It is built layer by layer through repeated emotional experiences, a little praise here, a little rejection there, a little comparison, a little fear, a little pressure to become someone acceptable. Over many years, these experiences quietly shape the ego until the person no longer knows what is truly natural within them. This is why so many people feel lost when relationships end, careers fail, or public approval disappears, because much of their identity was built on external reactions rather than inner awareness. When outside validation weakens, the self-image begins collapsing as well. You can see this everywhere in human life. Some people become obsessed with success because their worth became connected to achievement. Some become addicted to attention because they only feel valuable when noticed. Some become trapped in people-pleasing because rejection feels emotionally unbearable. Others become emotionally distant because vulnerability once caused them pain. But beneath all these patterns is the same hidden fear. The fear that without validation, they are nothing. The Vedas understood this suffering deeply. They taught that the ego survives through reflection. It constantly searches for confirmation from the outside world because it has forgotten its connection to inner truth. That is why the mind becomes addicted to praise and deeply wounded by criticism. The ego depends on external reaction to maintain its sense of identity, and this creates endless emotional instability. One compliment can suddenly make you feel worthy. One rejection can suddenly make you feel broken. One moment of attention can lift your confidence. One moment of being ignored can make you question your value. This is not true inner peace. This is emotional dependence. The deeper tragedy is that many people spend their entire lives protecting an image instead of discovering who they really are. They become attached to being perceived in a certain way: strong, successful, attractive, spiritual, important, needed, intelligent, calm. Different identities become emotional armor, protecting the ego from feeling insignificant. But maintaining these identities becomes exhausting because the mind constantly fears losing them. The successful person fears failure. The attractive person fears aging. The intelligent person fears being wrong. The strong person fears appearing weak. The spiritual person fears imperfection. Every ego identity creates hidden anxiety because it depends on maintaining an image. This is why many people secretly feel tired, even when their life appears successful from the outside. Their nervous system is carrying the pressure of protecting a personality all the time. They are not simply living anymore, they are managing identity constantly. The Vedas say this is one of the deepest illusions of human existence. You begin believing you are the role you perform. But you are not the personality built through reactions. You are not the image held in other people's minds. You are not the labels society placed upon you. You are not the emotional character created for survival. Those are temporary constructions of the mind. The real self exists beneath all of them. The real self is the silent awareness watching every role come and go. It watched you as a child before identity became heavy. It watched you during heartbreak. It watched you while pretending to be okay. It watched every version of you trying to feel accepted. And through all those changing identities, something inside remained untouched. But most people never discover this deeper awareness because they become completely hypnotized by personality. They spend so much time trying to improve the image that they forget to understand the observer behind it. That is why external success alone never creates lasting fulfillment. A person can achieve everything they once dreamed of and still feel empty inside because the soul is not searching for applause. The soul is searching for truth, and truth cannot be found in performance. Truth begins appearing the moment you stop asking, "How should I be seen?" and start asking, "Who am I beneath every role I learned to perform?" That question changes everything, because once you begin seeing how much of your identity was built through emotional conditioning, you also begin understanding something incredibly powerful. If the false self was created slowly, it can also be released slowly. The masks can fall, the fear can weaken, the performance can end, and beneath all the identities shaped by praise, rejection, comparison, and emotional survival, you may finally meet the self that existed before the world told you who you needed to become. You were trained to fear your real nature. One of the saddest truths about human life is that many people spend years hiding who they truly are without even realizing it. Somewhere along the journey of growing up, the natural self slowly becomes covered by fear, conditioning, pressure, and emotional survival. The person you were born as begins disappearing beneath the person the world taught you to become. The Vedas understood this deeply. They taught that the human being enters the world with a pure awareness, but over time the mind becomes conditioned by society, family, fear, comparison, and attachment. Slowly, the soul forgets its natural freedom and begins shaping itself around what feels emotionally safe, instead of what feels deeply true. As a child, your existence was natural. You laughed freely, you cried honestly, you expressed emotions without constantly monitoring yourself. You did not spend every moment worrying about how people perceived you. You simply existed. But little by little, the world began teaching you which parts of yourself were acceptable and which parts needed to be hidden. Perhaps you were told you were too emotional. Perhaps your sensitivity was misunderstood. Perhaps your honesty made others uncomfortable. Perhaps your dreams seemed unrealistic to the people around you. Perhaps expressing pain made you feel weak. Perhaps being different made you feel isolated. And slowly the conditioning began. You started studying people's reactions carefully. You learned which version of yourself received love and which version created discomfort. Without realizing it, you began editing your personality for survival. You became more controlled, more careful, more filtered, more afraid of being fully seen. This is how the fear of your real nature quietly begins. The Vedas teach that the ego becomes trapped the moment it starts choosing acceptance over authenticity. A person begins dividing themselves into acceptable and unacceptable parts. The acceptable parts are shown to the world. The unacceptable parts are hidden in silence. Over time, this creates inner fragmentation. One part of you wants freedom. Another part fears judgment. One part wants honesty. Another part fears rejection. One part wants to express emotion naturally. Another part fears appearing weak. This inner conflict slowly exhausts the human spirit, because the soul was never designed to live divided against itself. Many people appear normal externally while secretly carrying enormous emotional pressure internally. They are constantly managing how they appear to others. Every word becomes calculated. Every emotion becomes filtered. Every action becomes monitored. Even in private, the conditioning remains active because the mind has internalized the observer. This is why so many people feel anxious without understanding why. They are not simply living anymore. They are performing existence. The mind becomes trapped in constant self-awareness. You begin thinking about yourself while you are speaking. You analyze how you sound while expressing emotions. You judge yourself while trying to connect with people. Even simple moments become mentally exhausting because the natural flow of being has been replaced by performance. The Vedas describe this as a kind of invisible prison. Not a prison built with walls, but a prison built through conditioning. A prison where the soul becomes trapped beneath layers of fear and emotional adaptation. And the painful part is that society often rewards this imprisonment. People praise you when you suppress uncomfortable truths. They praise you when you become easier to control. They praise you when you hide your emotions and appear emotionally manageable. But deep inside, something within you slowly begins dying. Not physically, spiritually, because truth cannot breathe inside constant performance. The more disconnected you become from your real nature, the heavier life begins to feel. Even relationships become exhausting because you are not connecting from authenticity. You are connecting through masks. You are constantly adjusting yourself to remain emotionally safe. That is why many people secretly feel unseen, even when surrounded by others. Nobody truly knows them because even they have forgotten how to show themselves honestly. They have spent so many years hiding parts of themselves that the performance now feels more familiar than the truth. The Vedas remind us that the deepest suffering is not rejection from the world. The deepest suffering is rejection of your own nature. When you silence your truth repeatedly, your inner world becomes weaker. When you suppress your emotions constantly, your spirit becomes heavy. When you abandon your instincts for approval, you lose connection with your own guidance. And eventually, you begin feeling emotionally lost without knowing exactly why. But something very important begins happening. When awareness returns, you start noticing the performance. You begin seeing how often fear controls your behavior. You realize how much of your personality was shaped around avoiding rejection instead of expressing truth. You begin noticing how many times you betray your real feelings just to remain accepted. And although this realization can feel painful, it is also the beginning of awakening, because healing cannot begin until illusion becomes visible. The Vedas teach that the true self does not need permission to exist. It does not become more valuable through approval or less valuable through criticism. It simply is, whole, complete, untouched beneath all the conditioning. But rediscovering this truth requires courage, because the moment you begin returning to your real nature, Some people may no longer understand you. The version of you they became comfortable with may begin disappearing. The people who benefited from your silence may become uncomfortable with your honesty. The people who loved your performance may resist your authenticity, and that can feel frightening. But the Vedas remind us of something powerful. Anything that requires you to abandon your soul in order to keep it was never true peace in the first place. Real peace begins when you stop fearing your own nature. It begins when you stop apologizing for your sensitivity, when you stop shrinking your truth to remain acceptable, when you stop treating your emotions like weaknesses, when you stop living as a carefully edited version of yourself. Because beneath all the fear, all the conditioning, all the emotional masks, and all the performances, there is still a natural self within you that has never completely disappeared. A quiet self, a truthful self, a peaceful self, a self that existed before the world taught you to be afraid of who you really are. And perhaps your soul is becoming tired now, because it no longer wants to live hidden beneath performance. Perhaps that unexplained emptiness you feel is not weakness at all. Perhaps it is your real nature calling you back home to yourself. Comparison quietly separated you from your inner peace. One of the most silent and dangerous forms of suffering is comparison. It does not arrive loudly like heartbreak or loss. It enters the mind quietly, almost invisibly, and slowly begins poisoning the way you see yourself. The frightening part is that most people do not even realize how deeply comparison controls their emotions. They think they are simply observing the world, but internally they are constantly measuring their worth against other people's lives. The Vedas understood this ancient struggle long before modern society existed. They taught that the human mind loses peace the moment it becomes trapped in constant comparison, because comparison pulls awareness away from the soul and chains it to illusion. Instead of experiencing life directly, the mind becomes obsessed with measuring, competing, and judging. And this is exactly what happens to so many people today. You look at someone else's beauty and suddenly feel less attractive. You look at someone else's success and suddenly feel behind in life. You look at someone else's relationship and suddenly question your own worth. You look at someone else's confidence and suddenly feel small. Without realizing it, your emotional state begins changing every time you compare your existence to another person's reflection. The Vedas say this happens because the ego survives through measurement. The ego constantly wants proof that it matters, so it keeps comparing itself to others to feel either superior or inferior. But both states create suffering because peace can never exist in a mind trapped in psychological competition. This is why comparison quietly destroys inner peace. No matter how much you achieve, the mind immediately searches for someone who appears ahead of you. There is always another person who seems richer, happier, wiser, more attractive, more successful, more admired, more loved, or more fulfilled. And because of this, the mind never rests. It keeps chasing an imaginary moment where finally you will feel enough. But that moment never truly comes, because comparison is not really about other people. It is about disconnection from yourself. The more disconnected a person becomes from their own inner nature, the more obsessed they become with outside measurement. They stop experiencing life from within and begin evaluating themselves from outside perspectives. They become spectators of their own existence instead of participants in it. This is why social comparison creates such deep emotional exhaustion. Your attention becomes scattered everywhere except within yourself. You stop hearing your own voice because the noise of other people's lives becomes louder than your own inner truth. The Vedas teach that every soul carries a different path, a different rhythm, and a different unfolding. But comparison blinds people to this reality. It convinces them that life is a race instead of a journey of awakening. It teaches them to compete instead of understand, to imitate instead of discover, to chase instead of experience. And slowly, this comparison begins changing the way you see your own life. You stop appreciating your journey because you are too busy watching someone else's. You stop noticing your blessings because your attention becomes fixed on what others possess. You stop recognizing your growth because the mind keeps focusing on how far someone else appears ahead. This is how gratitude quietly disappears. And when gratitude disappears, peace disappears with it. Many people spend years believing they are failing in life, when in reality they are simply trapped inside endless comparison. They do not realize that their suffering is not always coming from their actual circumstances. Much of it is being created by the mind constantly measuring itself against illusions. Because most of what people compare themselves to is not even fully real. The world only shows polished surfaces. People display their victories but hide their emptiness. They show confidence while secretly feeling insecure. They show happiness while privately carrying pain. They show success while emotionally exhausted inside. But the comparing mind does not see hidden suffering. It only sees appearances. And the Vedas repeatedly warn that appearances are one of the greatest illusions of human life. This is why comparison keeps the soul trapped in dissatisfaction. The mind becomes addicted to chasing a life that only exists through perception. And eventually, a person no longer knows how to simply exist peacefully. Even moments of rest become difficult because the mind keeps asking, "Am I doing enough? Am I successful enough? Am I attractive enough? Am I behind? Am I wasting my life?" The soul becomes exhausted from carrying constant invisible pressure. But the Vedas reveal something incredibly important. Peace begins returning the moment comparison weakens. Because comparison is impossible when awareness becomes present. The present moment does not compare. Nature does not compare. The sky does not compare itself to the ocean. The moon does not compete with the stars. A flower does not question whether another flower is more beautiful. Everything in existence simply expresses its nature fully without psychological competition. Only the conditioned human mind constantly measures itself, and this endless measurement separates people from peace. The deeper tragedy is that comparison slowly steals authenticity as well. The more people compare themselves, the more they begin copying each other. They stop listening to their own instincts. They stop trusting their own path. They begin shaping themselves according to trends, expectations, and external definitions of success. This creates enormous spiritual emptiness because the soul was never meant to become a copy of someone else's life. The Vedas teach that truth can only be found when a person returns to their own center. Not the center created by society, not the center created by comparison, but the quiet inner awareness beneath all external pressure. And perhaps this is why so many people secretly feel tired all the time. Not because they are physically exhausted, but because mentally they are carrying thousands of invisible comparisons every single day, comparing appearances, comparing achievements, comparing relationships, comparing lifestyles, comparing timelines, comparing identities. The mind becomes overcrowded with endless measurement, and slowly the soul loses its natural stillness. But healing begins when you finally realize something profound. Your worth was never meant to be measured against another human being. Your path is unfolding differently because your soul is different. Your timing is different. Your lessons are different. Your awakening is different. And the moment you stop competing with everyone around you, life begins feeling lighter again. You begin breathing differently, thinking differently, living differently. For the first time in years, you stop monitoring your existence and start experiencing it. You stop asking, "How do I compare?" and begin asking, "What feels true for my soul?" That question changes everything, because real peace does not come from becoming better than others. Real peace comes from finally becoming present enough to stop abandoning yourself through endless comparison. And perhaps the reason your soul feels so tired today is because it was never designed to carry the weight of constantly measuring its value against the world. The person you perform is not the person you are. One of the deepest illusions the human mind can fall into is believing that the role it performs is its true identity. Over time, people become so attached to the personality they present to the world that they completely forget there is something much deeper beneath it. The Vedas teach that this is one of the greatest forms of spiritual forgetting. A person becomes so hypnotized by the character they have created that they lose connection with the silent awareness behind the performance. Most people do not even realize how much of their life has become acting. They perform strength while secretly feeling broken inside. They perform happiness while emotionally exhausted. They perform confidence while constantly doubting themselves. They perform calmness while carrying storms within their mind. They perform independence while deeply fearing abandonment. And because this performance is repeated every day, eventually the mind begins believing the mask itself is real. But the Vedas remind us of something powerful. The person you perform is not the person you truly are. The personality you show the world was shaped through survival, conditioning, fear, emotional experiences, and social adaptation. It was built slowly over many years in response to praise, rejection, pain, expectations, and attachment. Every experience added another layer to the identity you now carry. Perhaps you became the strong one because nobody comforted you when you were hurting. Perhaps you became the quiet one because expressing yourself once brought shame or rejection. Perhaps you became the funny one because making others laugh was the only time you felt noticed. Perhaps you became the successful one because achievement made you feel worthy. Perhaps you became the people pleaser because losing connection terrified you. Slowly, these emotional survival patterns became personality, and after enough time passed, you stopped questioning them. You simply called them me. But the Vedas teach that personality is not the deepest truth of who you are. Personality changes constantly throughout life. The version of you that existed 10 years ago is not the same version existing today. Your thoughts change, your emotions change, your fears change, your desires change. Your behavior changes depending on who you are around. Yet despite all these changes, something within you has remained present through every version of yourself. That silent presence is the deeper self, the awareness beneath the performance. It watched you as a child before fear became heavy. It watched you during heartbreak. It watched you while pretending to be okay. It watched every version of yourself trying to survive emotionally. And through all those changing identities, something within you remained untouched. The Vedas describe this awareness as the witness consciousness, the silent observer behind all thoughts, emotions, roles, and personalities. It is not damaged by rejection or improved by praise because it exists beyond the temporary movements of the ego. But most people spend their entire lives disconnected from this deeper awareness because they are too busy protecting the performance. They become emotionally attached to maintaining the image they created. They fear being misunderstood because misunderstanding threatens the identity they built. They fear failure because failure threatens the personality they depend on. They fear rejection because rejection shakes the image they present to the world. This creates enormous inner pressure. Because maintaining a performance requires constant energy, you must constantly monitor yourself, constantly adjust yourself, constantly protect the image, constantly think about how others perceive you, and over time, this becomes emotionally exhausting. The soul grows tired because it was never meant to carry the burden of pretending endlessly. This is why many people feel strangely disconnected from themselves even when life appears successful externally. Deep inside, they know the image others love is not fully real. They know people are often interacting with the performance, not the deeper self hidden underneath it. And perhaps this is one of the loneliest feelings a human being can experience. To be surrounded by attention, praise, or relationships, yet secretly feel unseen because the real self remains hidden beneath masks. The Vedas teach that awakening begins when a person starts noticing the difference between the observer and the performance. You begin realizing that thoughts are appearing within you, but they are not your deepest identity. Emotions are moving through you, but they are not your permanent self. Roles are being played by you, but they are not your eternal nature. This realization changes everything, because once you stop completely identifying with the performance, something inside you begins relaxing. You no longer feel the same desperate need to maintain an image. You stop exhausting yourself trying to appear perfect. You stop shaping your existence around external validation. You stop fearing every judgment and criticism so deeply because slowly you begin understanding that the role is temporary, but the awareness behind it is real. The Vedas repeatedly remind us that peace cannot exist while a person remains trapped inside false identity. The ego constantly fears collapse because everything it depends on is temporary. Beauty changes, status changes, relationships change, success changes, public opinion changes, and when identity is built entirely on temporary things, fear becomes unavoidable. But the deeper self does not fear these changes because it was never created by them. It existed before the performance began, and it will remain after the performance ends. This is why moments of silence can sometimes feel so powerful and emotional. During deep stillness, the masks temporarily weaken, the endless performance slows down, the pressure to appear a certain way begins fading for a moment, and suddenly you feel something difficult to explain. A strange sense of recognition, a quiet feeling that beneath all the noise, there is still a real self waiting for you. Many people mistake this feeling for sadness, but it is not sadness. It is remembrance, the soul remembering itself beneath the personality. The Vedas teach that true freedom begins the moment you stop trying to become somebody and start reconnecting with the awareness that already exists within you, not the awareness shaped by society, not the awareness built through comparison, but the untouched presence beneath all conditioning. And perhaps this is why your soul feels tired sometimes. Not because life itself is too heavy, but because pretending for too long becomes unbearable. The performance demands endless energy. But truth is effortless. Truth does not need constant maintenance. Truth does not fear exposure. Truth does not depend on applause. It simply exists. And maybe your life is now reaching a point where the masks no longer feel comfortable. Maybe the version of yourself created for survival is becoming too exhausting to carry. Maybe your soul is quietly asking you to stop performing and finally return to what is real. Because beneath every role, every fear, every emotional mask, and every personality you learn to protect, there is still a deeper self within you that has never disappeared. A silent self, a peaceful self, a truthful self, a self untouched by society's expectations. And the moment you begin reconnecting with that deeper awareness, something extraordinary happens. For the first time in years, you stop asking, "How should I appear?" and begin asking, "Who am I?" when there is nothing left to perform. That question is not the end of your journey. It is the beginning of awakening. Awakening begins when the false self starts falling apart. Most people think awakening will feel peaceful in the beginning. They imagine it as light, clarity, happiness, or instant inner freedom. But the Vedas reveal something very different. Real awakening often begins with discomfort, confusion, emotional pain, and the slow collapse of everything false you once believed about yourself. Because before truth can fully enter your life, illusion must first begin breaking apart. And illusion does not disappear quietly. The false self fights to survive. The ego resists change because the ego was built entirely around attachment, fear, identity, and emotional survival. It wants familiarity, even when familiarity is painful. It would rather remain trapped in old patterns than step into the unknown truth of who you really are. That is why awakening often feels like losing yourself before finding yourself. The version of you created through conditioning slowly begins cracking. The masks that once felt safe begin feeling heavy. The personality you spent years protecting no longer feels natural anymore. The need for constant approval becomes exhausting. The endless performance becomes unbearable. Slowly, the soul begins rejecting the false identity it once used to survive. And this can feel terrifying, because when the false self starts collapsing, the mind does not immediately experience freedom. At first, it experiences emptiness, confusion, uncertainty. You begin questioning things that once felt stable. Relationships begin changing. Old desires lose their power. Certain conversations start feeling empty. Some environments begin feeling emotionally heavy. You notice that the life you once worked so hard to maintain no longer fully satisfies your soul. And the strange part is that you may not even understand why this is happening. The Vedas teach that this stage is deeply sacred because it marks the beginning of inner awakening. The soul is starting to separate itself from illusion. The false identity that once controlled your life begins weakening, and awareness slowly begins returning. But awakening requires loss. This is one of the hardest truths to accept. You cannot remember your true nature while remaining attached to every false version of yourself. Some beliefs must collapse. Some emotional attachments must break. Some identities must die. Some relationships may fade. Some old versions of you may no longer survive this transformation, and that can feel deeply painful because the ego experiences change as death. The ego built its entire existence around attachment. Attachment to validation, attachment to identity, attachment to relationships, attachment to control, attachment to being seen a certain way. So when awakening begins dissolving these attachments, the mind panics. It feels like something is being taken away. But the Vedas remind us of something powerful. What is false must eventually fall apart, so truth can finally be seen clearly. This is why many awakenings begin through suffering. Sometimes heartbreak reveals how much of yourself you abandoned for love. Sometimes loneliness reveals how dependent you became on validation. Sometimes failure reveals how much your worth was attached to achievement. Sometimes emotional exhaustion reveals how long you have been pretending. Pain becomes the force that cracks illusion open, and although suffering feels heavy in the moment, it often becomes the doorway back to awareness. The Vedas never taught that suffering itself is the goal. They taught that suffering exposes attachment. It reveals the places where you lost yourself. It shows you the identities built from fear instead of truth. And slowly, as awakening deepens, you begin seeing your life differently. You notice how much energy was spent maintaining false images. You notice how often fear shaped your decisions. You notice how many relationships depended on your performance instead of your authenticity. You notice how much of your life was built around avoiding rejection instead of expressing truth. This realization can feel overwhelming at first because illusion once felt safe. Even painful identities can feel comforting when they become familiar. The ego would rather suffer inside what it knows than step into the uncertainty of transformation. But eventually, something deeper within you begins speaking louder than fear. A quiet inner voice begins asking questions the ego cannot answer. Why am I constantly pretending? Why do I fear being fully seen? Why does external validation control my peace? Who am I beneath all these roles? And these questions begin changing everything, because awakening is not about becoming someone new. It is about seeing clearly for the first time. The Vedas teach that truth already exists within you. It was never missing. It was simply buried beneath conditioning, fear, emotional attachment, and psychological illusion. Awakening begins when those layers slowly start falling away, and this process is not always graceful. Some days you may feel deeply clear, other days you may feel emotionally lost. Some days you may feel peaceful, other days you may feel like your entire identity is dissolving. But this inner collapse is not failure, it is transformation. The false self is weakening. The version of you built entirely around approval, performance, fear, and attachment can no longer survive in the same way once awareness begins returning. And although this process feels painful, something beautiful is happening underneath it. For the first time in your life, you are beginning to see yourself beyond illusion. Not through society's expectations, not through comparison, not through relationships, not through performance, but directly, honestly, silently. The Vedas describe this as the beginning of inner liberation. A person stops identifying completely with the temporary personality and starts reconnecting with the deeper awareness beneath it all. And once this process begins, life can never fully return to the old unconscious way of living again, because you cannot unknow what awareness has revealed. You cannot completely return to performance. Once you have tasted authenticity, you cannot fully believe illusion once truth begins exposing it. That is why awakening changes people so deeply, not because they become perfect, but because they can no longer comfortably live disconnected from themselves. The old masks begin feeling unbearable. The old attachments begin feeling heavy. The old identities begin feeling incomplete, and slowly the soul starts choosing truth over performance, even if it means walking through uncertainty, even if it means letting old versions of yourself die, because deep inside, something within you finally understands that losing the false self is not destruction, it is freedom. And perhaps the reason your life feels different lately, perhaps the reason certain things no longer satisfy you, perhaps the reason you feel emotionally tired of pretending, is because awakening has already begun quietly inside you. The false self is slowly falling apart, and beneath the collapse, your real self is waiting to rise. The self you lost has been waiting for you in silence. After years of trying to become who the world wanted you to be, there comes a moment when the soul quietly becomes tired of performing, tired of pretending, tired of carrying identities that never fully felt real, tired of chasing acceptance while feeling disconnected inside. And in that exhaustion, something sacred begins happening. You begin longing for yourself again, not the personality created through survival, not the version shaped by fear, not the identity built from comparison, validation, pressure, and emotional performance, but the deeper self beneath all of it, the self you lost while trying to be loved. The Vedas teach that this longing is not weakness, it is remembrance. It is the soul beginning to awaken from years of psychological illusion. Because deep inside, something within you has always known that the masks were never your true face. No matter how convincing the performance became, the real self never completely disappeared. It simply became buried beneath noise, buried beneath fear, buried beneath conditioning, buried beneath the endless pressure to become acceptable. And perhaps this is why, even after receiving approval, attention, love, or success, something within you still felt incomplete, because external acceptance can never fully satisfy a soul that has become disconnected from itself. The world taught you to search for fulfillment outside yourself. The Vedas teach you to return within. For most of your life, you were trained to believe that happiness would arrive through becoming more admired, more attractive, more successful, more desired, more important, more perfect. But every time you reached one goal, another desire appeared immediately afterward. The mind kept chasing because the ego survives through becoming. It constantly whispers, once you achieve this, then you will finally feel enough. But enoughness never arrives through endless chasing, because the soul is not searching for more identity. The soul is searching for freedom from false identity. And this realization changes everything. The Vedas reveal that your deepest suffering never came from being imperfect. It came from forgetting who you truly were beneath all the conditioning. You spent years trying to improve the mask while the real self quietly waited underneath it all. And despite everything that happened to you, despite every heartbreak, every rejection, every failure, every emotional wound, the deeper self within you remained untouched. This is one of the most beautiful truths hidden inside the Vedas. Your real nature was never broken, only covered by fear, covered by shame, covered by emotional pain, covered by years of trying to survive in a world that taught you to doubt your own worth. But the soul beneath those layers remained whole the entire time. That is why moments of silence can sometimes feel strangely emotional. During stillness, the noise weakens for a moment, the performance slows down, the pressure to become someone fades briefly, and suddenly you feel something ancient within yourself, a quiet presence, a deep stillness, a strange feeling of recognition that is difficult to explain with words, almost as if something inside you whispers, you were never meant to become all these masks. The Vedas teach that awakening is not becoming divine. It is remembering that your essence was never separate from truth to begin with. The self you have been searching for has never been missing. It has only been waiting beneath all the noise, waiting beneath your overthinking, waiting beneath your fear of rejection, waiting beneath your endless comparison, waiting beneath every role you performed to feel accepted. And perhaps that is why your soul feels emotional when you hear certain truths. Not because you are learning something completely new, but because something ancient inside you is recognizing itself again. The deepest transformation does not happen when you create a new identity. It happens when you finally stop running from your real nature. When you stop trying to earn worth through performance. When you stop shaping your life around fear of judgment. When you stop abandoning your truth for temporary acceptance. Slowly, you begin returning to yourself, and this return changes the way you experience everything. You stop forcing connections that require masks. You stop chasing approval from people who cannot truly see you. You stop measuring your value through comparison. You stop exhausting yourself trying to appear perfect. You begin breathing differently, thinking differently, living differently. For the first time in years, your nervous system begins relaxing, because the soul no longer feels trapped inside constant performance. The Vedas teach that true peace is not created by controlling the world around you. Peace appears naturally when inner conflict ends, and inner conflict ends the moment you stop fighting your own nature. The moment you stop dividing yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. The moment you stop hiding pieces of your soul to remain loved. The moment you stop carrying identities that no longer feel true. That is when healing deepens, not because life suddenly becomes perfect, but because you are no longer at war with yourself. Many people spend their entire lives trying to become someone worthy of love, while never realizing they were already worthy before the world taught them to doubt themselves. The child within you did not originally hate themselves. The fear came later, the shame came later, the comparison came later, the emotional masks came later. Your original nature existed before all of it. And even now, after years of conditioning, that original self still exists within you, quietly, patiently, waiting. The Vedas say that truth is never lost. Human beings simply become distracted from it. They become hypnotized by illusion, identity, social pressure, and attachment until they forget the silent awareness beneath everything. But eventually, life begins guiding the soul back home, sometimes through pain, sometimes through loneliness, sometimes through emotional exhaustion, sometimes through a deep feeling that the old way of living no longer feels real anymore. And perhaps that is exactly where you are now. Perhaps your soul has become tired of pretending. Perhaps the masks no longer feel comfortable. Perhaps you can no longer fully betray yourself just to remain accepted. Perhaps something deeper inside you is finally waking up. Because awakening often begins quietly, not through loud transformation, but through small moments of honesty, moments where you stop pretending, moments where you stop performing, moments where you finally sit alone with yourself and realize how long you have been searching outside for something that was always within. And maybe that is the final truth the Vedas were trying to reveal all along. You do not need to become someone else to find peace. You only need to remember the self you abandoned while trying to survive the world. The self that existed before fear shaped your personality. The self that existed before rejection made you question your worth. The self that existed before comparison stole your peace. That self is still within you, still breathing beneath every mask, still waiting beneath every performance, still calling you back through every moment of emptiness, exhaustion, and longing. And perhaps tonight, for the first time in a very long time, you are finally beginning to hear that call clearly, not from the world, but from your own soul. And maybe now, you finally understand why your soul has felt so tired for so long. It was never only because of pain. It was never only because of heartbreak, rejection, loneliness, or disappointment. It was because somewhere along the way, you forgot yourself. You became so focused on being accepted, so focused on becoming lovable, so focused on fitting inside other people's expectations, that you slowly drifted away from your own center. The Vedas teach that the deepest suffering is not failing the world. The deepest suffering is losing connection with your own true nature. Because no matter how much approval you receive, no matter how much attention, success, validation, or praise enters your life, Nothing can fully heal the emptiness created by self-abandonment. Only truth can do that. Only remembrance can do that. And perhaps that is why this message found you tonight. Not to give you another identity to chase, not to make you become someone new, but to gently remind you of the self that has been waiting beneath all the noise, the self beneath the anxiety, the self beneath the overthinking, the self beneath the masks, the pressure, the fear, and the endless performance, a quiet self, a peaceful self, a self that never needed to prove its worth to exist. The world may have taught you to see yourself through broken mirrors, but your soul was never broken, only covered. And maybe healing begins the moment you stop asking the world who you are and finally sit in silence long enough to hear your own soul answer. So tonight, stop trying to become more acceptable. Stop trying to become more impressive. Stop exhausting yourself trying to be enough for everyone around you. And ask yourself one honest question. Who would I be if I no longer feared being fully seen? Because hidden beneath that question is the life you were always meant to live. And hidden beneath all the identities you carried is the person you were before the world taught you to forget yourself. If this message reached something deep inside you, let it stay with you tonight. And if your soul is slowly waking up from the illusion, then perhaps this is not the end of your journey. Perhaps this is the beginning of finally returning home to yourself. If this message spoke to something deep inside you, then don't ignore that feeling. Your soul does not resonate with truth by accident. So before you leave tonight, take one quiet moment for yourself. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and ask yourself honestly, how much of my life have I spent trying to become acceptable instead of becoming real? And if somewhere inside you, a forgotten part of yourself is finally beginning to wake up, then stay connected with us here on the Silent Vedas, because this journey is not about escaping life. It is about remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. Subscribe now and walk this path with us in silence, awareness, and truth. And if this message found you at the right moment, leave a comment below with these words: I am returning to myself. Because sometimes healing begins the moment the soul finally decides to stop running from its own truth.